So the title of the panel that we're doing today, it's a little bit shortened because it's just been hard to bring everybody in, is self-respect, have we lost it? So the whole, oops, is somebody asking me a question? No, I'm sorry. It's hard to see beyond the light. Self-respect, have we lost it? And we're looking at it from the perspective, of course, of yoga, because here we are, all yoga interested people or yoga practitioners, and we're looking at what is self-respect. So what we're going to be exploring here is self-respect with a little s and self-respect with a big S. So respect for ourselves and respect for the bigger self that we talk of in yoga, which we're all very much part. So I'm going to open the proceedings with asking Jess, actually, just to say a little bit about it, because what we are experiencing in this society can perhaps be seen as a fairly high level of violence. Like, I don't know if any of you have children. Maybe you have children like my child who, for leisure, watches those television programs that are all about, who killed who and how. It's and what happened then and how they found them, and that's her leisure. To sit there for 2 or 3 hours in an evening and watch these murderous kind of things happening. There's a lot of violence going on. So violence to self-inflicted violence also, in terms of body abuse, in terms of what we eat, what we don't eat, and what we do in terms of drug intake, how we do with no sleep, what we do in terms of pushing too hard, a whole lot of things that start here. And then there's the violence that is more obvious, perhaps, which is between people. And one of the big issues that we've got going on in our society here in Australia and perhaps the whole world is the issue of domestic violence. So that's why we've invited Jess, just to have a little chat to us about the status quo of domestic violence in Australia at the moment. It's pretty front and foremost, with Rosie Batty being the Ambassador,
Former Australian of the Year.
That's it. Yeah. Former Australian of the Year, that's her title. But wow, what a job that woman did last year of getting it into focus, and White Ribbon Day was quite something last year, and hopefully will be even bigger this year, and hopefully this will be not an issue in the future. So would you like to have a little chat? Yeah. Please, if those of you who are speaking, do use the mic so that it can be recorded for posterity. Yeah. Can you pull it out of there?
Yep, that's good. Hi everyone, thanks for joining us in the rain. So I guess, just as you were talking then, there's so many different ways that you could come at the issue of self-respect through the prism of domestic violence. I guess as you were talking then, I thought really about both from the male and female side of things. So let's say from the female side of things around self-respect, it's very difficult as a woman to have total self-respect. I think a lot of us live with really a kind of body dysmorphia that's put on us by capitalism and women's magazines and the expectation around appearance, not to mention the much more subtle and unconscious messages around where we fit in society and how much power and respect we should have as women in society, in, dare I say it, a patriarchal society. I know that's a bit of a dirty word, but, there's still the lingering structure that we live under. But, within that patriarchal society, men also live. And a lot of the time, the domestic violence sector can come at domestic violence perpetrators as though they abuse because they benefit from it. And surely I've seen a lot of men who that it very much looks like that. But I guess if we take it from a yogic perspective or from a Buddhist perspective, perpetrators are miserable people too. And in the patriarchal structure, men have all of these expectations around how they should behave, that they should be in control, that they should be, that they need to present a certain way in order to make sure that they don't get violence inflicted on them, usually by other men. So, Margaret Atwood has a great line in one of her books, which is, men are afraid that women will laugh at them. Men are afraid that women will laugh at them. Women are afraid that men will kill them. And on the surface of things, that makes men look pretty bad. But actually, if you deconstruct that, that they're afraid that women will laugh at them. They're afraid generally that, but when someone laughs at them, that is making them vulnerable, and making them vulnerable to the sort of violence that they can encounter on the streets as well. So that's a very generous perspective towards perpetrators, and I understand it's not shared by a lot of people, but that's what I'm sort of trying to run over in my head as I'm dealing with domestic violence in the book that I'm writing. The second thing I just want to say before I pass on to everybody else is self-respect is something that needs to not only be just internalised but conscious, I think, because like I was writing about this woman this morning. She grew up with a very loving family, was quite sheltered. At age 17, she met a man who she thought was very worldly, a bit older than her. They began a relationship where the first pointers that he was giving about her appearance seemed very helpful, like don't wear white pants because you can see your underpants through them and you don't want to look like a tart. And she thought, well, thank you very much. That's really genuine, helpful advice. And then that started to become, don't wear dresses because people will want to touch you. Don't see your mother, she's bad for you. Don't see your sister, blah, blah, blah. All the way through to one anecdote she told me where he said, don't leave the bathroom door closed because I can't trust you not to hang your breasts out the window to show people who are in the neighbouring property. So, but he was able to get through on that subtle level of control because she couldn't pick when that started to become disrespectful. And she was so young and no one had ever told her that those are the sorts of things that are disrespectful. So she'd never even questioned her sense of self-respect. And the sorts of things that can intervene in that are some of the school programs that are going on at the moment, which I think are magnificent. White Ribbon is running a program in a South Sydney school where there was a real concern from staff about bullying, not only just general bullying, but some of the things that the boys were saying to the girls at school, really sexually derogatory comments, and they decided they needed to do something about it. So they segregated the boys and girls into different classes. And first they taught the boys that, hey, this is not on. And the boys were actually genuinely interested in finding out that what they were saying was not appropriate. They just had been saying it quite naturally without thinking. But to the girls, they said, when a boy yells out a sexually derogatory comment to you, you don't put up with it. And they said within a few months, the girls who had literally just been taking whatever the boys were dishing out to them were taking none of it, and were really conscious of how their self-respect meant that they didn't have to put up with things from other people. And actually overall, bullying and fighting at that school went down 80%. And it was just all around consciousness and kids having a chance to talk about it. So that's my spiel. I hope that made sense. It's all stuff that's just revolving around my head.
And what's the book that you're writing?
Thanks. It's a book on the phenomenon of domestic violence in Australia. I guess, like, to put it, as succinctly as possible, really from the bedroom to the courtroom. So the psychology of victims and perpetrators all the way through to what happens when women are dragged through family court and beyond. So.
Wow. That's a timely book. And I love that kind of a statistic that, how was it? Within a few months, 80% of the bullying and violence had gone down. That's outrageous, isn't it? I just love that you said that that's about the shift in consciousness that brought that about. And I'm thinking what just happened here with that tiny little meditation that we did for all of 3 minutes. Did anybody feel the shift there? Like, it's so crazy, isn't it? We just have to keep encouraging each other to make that shift. We have to keep giving each other the tools to make that shift from where we've been and what it seems to us to be totally normal but is way off the mark. I would love to ask Keenan to say a little bit about his thinking about big self, little self, or yogic thinking. Yeah. And there's one other thing I want to say about Keenan. So Keenan came last year to World Yoga Day, or not actually to World Yoga Day, but after it we assisted the Big Kitchen. Does anybody know the Big Kitchen up the road? Amazing institution. They make food for people who are homeless and people who are in trouble and all kinds of people. And they get people who are in jail to come out on day programs and do that, and they teach kids how to do it, and they teach homeless people how to cook, and it's just one big kitchen. It literally is, it never stops, morning, noon and night. So they ran a big dinner, and Keenan was up there doing the meditation of food. Was that what it was?
I think it's Jyoti meditation.
Jyoti meditation.
Life meditation, yeah.
Okay, life meditation to a group of people that perhaps had not done that before. Maybe 40 or 50 women, and it was the most awesome evening, really. It was so gentle and so from the heart. So that's why Keenan's sitting here with us, because it was a very respectful and beautiful meditation that he offered the women, mostly women, up there last World Yoga Day. Keenan's also been telling me that in terms of respect, one of his bigger experiences in life has been working in the Congo for Médecins Sans Frontières. Yep. And experiencing what real disrespect can do to a population of people, and how that felt to be part of it, and what he's come away with. So on that note, please.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you for joining us all too. We can't actually see you. I know you're out there, out there somewhere. But yeah, I guess I was inspired to teach yoga because of my time in Congo. I spent 6 months in Congo running a hospital, and we provided fantastic medical aid, but what I noticed was that it was more or less Band-Aid solutions. It wasn't actually solving the issue, which was the way people think, and understanding karma, and understanding the philosophies of yoga, and understanding the repercussions that our actions, our thoughts, our words have. I could see how much damage people were doing to themselves and to the community. And it really, really saddened me to see that particularly the men would be sitting back watching the women carrying bundles of blue metal or stone up on their shoulders, making them work, and whilst the men would drink banana beer all day. And it was there I decided that, okay, well, maybe there's another way to help people, and my intention was to help. I figured that's the best path to yoga, is karma yoga, is the path of selfless service. So I decided there to go back to India and spend almost 3 years there studying all that I could to understand the teachings of yoga, and to understand, I guess, the connection that we all have with one another. And I think in understanding that connection, I think knowledge is the key, and use of consciousness, and becoming more conscious, becoming more aware that we are unified, that we are a part of something. We can't really explain it. No words will ever do it justice, but there is nothing that really separates us other than thought. And this notion that we are individual separate beings is what I believe causes all the suffering in this world. From a human perspective, I think the yogis define this as ego. Ego is the notion where the self, capital S, is somehow lost in a misidentification with form, with body and mind, and as a result, they call it the 5 causes of suffering, the 5 kleshas in yoga. The first cause of suffering is ignorance. Ignorance is defined as believing that which is real to be unreal, and that which is unreal to be real. And this notion that the world is real, and that the universal intelligence, or they call it tat, that is unreal, is common. And we too often forget our spiritual nature. We're so caught up in doing, we forget about the being, the spiritual aspect of being. And I always like to consider this and offer this to the students that I teach, is that we must remember that we're always being no matter what we're doing. We're always doing, the body's always doing something, the mind is always doing something, but we are still always being. But being so caught up in doing, and so caught up in this limited individual self, creates what could be called the poisons of the mind, and they include greed, they include lust, and they include anger, and pride and jealousy, and all the other poisons of the mind. And I would say as a result, that's more than likely the cause of so much lack of respect, in families, in communities, with people, even with their own bodies. People lack that respect. And I think once people start to gain knowledge and understanding, there's something that struck me. I always look at the story of Yellowstone National Park, where they eliminated the wolves. They just killed all the wolves, and all of a sudden the land started to erode. And they're like, well, what's going on here? And it made common sense after some time that the wolves were no longer killing the elk, so the elk were eating the leaves high and low, and before you know it, the trees were dying, and as a result, the land was eroding. And so it's very evident, it's very clear scientifically, quantum philosophically, religiously, it's very clear that we are a part of something. We're not separate, but rather a whole. We're a part of a whole. And once we start to recognize that, I think naturally respect starts to occur, a natural sense of self-respect and a natural sense of respect for others. It's still to this day for me, also easy to be meditating and chanting and repeating mantras, and then yet get caught up in a traffic jam and someone cuts me off and out comes the bird. I'm like, ooh, how did that happen? But still, under this spell of delusion. And I think that's why it's so important that we have practices like yoga that help to bring us on the path and set our set of consciousness for the day, that we may start to, in those moments where we are about to give the bird or offend someone, that we can just quit that, cut that, and recognize that the same light exists within you as does within me, which is namaste.
Thank you very much for crash course in yoga philosophy. Yeah, I think these are things that are very familiar to all of us as yogis, and I often wonder how we spread that net of understanding so that people have something to think about, some other tools to go to, some other way of being that actually allows them to make choice, to realise that they have a choice about being violent. Flicking the bird, is that what you call it? Flicking the bird or smiling sweetly.
Okay, can I add one more thing about philosophy? Because, you probably all heard the term that philosophy without practice is worthless, right? But so too is practice without philosophy. There has to be some philosophical thread that's leading us to practice. We have to have faith in that philosophy. One of the key cornerstones of practice is faith. And that enables us to then push forth and make the efforts that we need to do, to raise that state of consciousness.
Thank you. The embodiment part is all important, and I guess that's what I hope yoga is bringing to this Australia now, with everybody practicing yoga, doing their practice. I'd like to just swing over to Konstantin to talk a little bit about his concepts around the science of the bigger self, or the connection of all things, which I know you've done a lot of research and have lived a lot.
Yes. Basically, pretty much over the last 3 decades, I've been working in the field of trying to find something that will help everybody understand their true nature from a non-personal, non-secular, non-religious, non-specific background which they over-identify with regarding either their religious background, their philosophy, their cultural beliefs, or any belief system, in fact. And the one thing that I observed that was taking over rapidly, particularly through IT, was science. And it suddenly became, through technology, of course, an integral part of everyone's lives. I often, when I'm teaching and working with people, ask them, please, hand up who would have no problem whatsoever in losing their mobile phone and all their IT. They could carry on their daily life as if nothing happened. And in addition, your electricity was off and your gas is off and you're off the grid. And of course, most people have a bit of a shock and they preempt something happening that might actually put themselves into quite a state. The degree to which we have handed power over to technology is enormous, especially IT. And by using the science that we have that will enable us to see similarities, because fundamentally we've got 3 areas. There's Newtonian mechanics, and that means we see everything from a material point of view according to the 3 great laws of motion that Newton had discovered, and also his understanding of gravity, all very important, but only on a certain scale. As soon as we start trying to understand things on the little scale, the nanoscale, none of that really works. Enter Einstein, who says, yes, but everything is relative to your position and to time. Suddenly something new was introduced that's been there for thousands of years, according to wisdom traditions, but never spoken about in a manner that could use numbers and symbols. So we're looking at the quantifiable as opposed to the qualifiable. And these are two main issues that need to be understood. And then Niels Bohr came in and said, well, you know what? On this very tiny level, we've got electrons behaving in interesting ways. First off, they can occupy distinct shells, which means they have distinct amounts of energy. A little bit after that, someone else came along and said, well, you know what? We can do something here and it affects something in the other side of the universe. Einstein didn't like that. He called that spooky. He was really upset with that. And he said, it doesn't fit into a box and everything has to be discernible. He could not stand the idea that life in the universe could be unpredictable. Of course, Buddhism teaches impermanence, and there are many aspects through our wisdom traditions where we see all of these factors. Then came another chap that I know personally and done some work with him. He's written a book on string theory, and it's called Entanglement, the fact that we are all entangled in one way or another with other people. And I'd go as far as to say we're very entangled with ourselves. Our thoughts are very entangled with our feelings, with our sensations, with our physical body and our body electric, without which we're not alive. Nothing fires, no electricity is flowing in the body. And now I've come up recently with coherence theory. What is that about? Well, interestingly enough, about 95% of science today, and I worked with two universities in particular, and one's very old school, it's Moscow State University Pedagogics. And they've done lots of work and research in the paranormal and the metaphysical since the 1920s. I would say more than anyone else on the planet. And about 90% of it has yet to be translated from Russian. And all the work is very, very phenomenal in terms of the findings. And the basic premise that everybody still perceives, experiences, and describes life on is very Newtonian. And yet we're using devices. Hand up who's got a smartphone. Yeah. Do you know how the smartphone works? Don't worry, hardly anybody does. I've spent quite a while learning from an engineer how it actually crams that much information at such a speed into a tiny little card and can do all of the processing that it does. And it's very similar to our bodies. Where that little card is concerned, you've got many laminated layers of electrons shifting in vertical and horizontal planes. With us, we have something else happening. It's quite amazing. What are we made up of mostly? Yeah. So 70% by volume, 99% molecularly of water. And water, between the little hydrogens, you've got your O and your funny tetrahedron, which is kind of two little lines that way, is a very mild magnetic field, and that's where memory is stored. That's why who has heard of Masaru Emoto's work, Hidden Messages in Water, where water was spoken to or music was played to it, and whenever the message was negative, like I hate you, you're stupid, you're a fool, the water was frozen, and as it thawed, it was being photographed, and the crystals were all very badly damaged and looked quite amorphic. And whenever music like Mozart or Chopin was played, and I Love You was a really good one, the crystals are very beautiful and very harmonic. So it shows us that if we're made up 99% of water, it isn't just our ear that hears information that's negative about us that disturbs or gets disturbed our harmony. It's actually the water in your entire plasma, in your entire body, that gets broken and disturbed. So we need to go back to an ancient principle in terms of how we communicate with each other. Where I come from, my family is from the Black Sea, who are the ancient Ionians who've lived there for 3,000 years. And we have fused with the Caucasian Georgians and about 12 civilizations during the last 4,000 years. And the one thing that is prevalent and common to all is the mother principle. And the mother principle begins with mother on earth, Father in heaven, but mother in the cosmos that made the Father. And this is very, very significant to understand. It's there in the Kabbalah, it's there in the tantric practice of Tibetan Buddhism, and in the Bon, we're talking about the Mother Tantra. And it's the creation theory. And this is where everything is born from and arises from and goes back to, which means innately and inherently, first and foremost, the body of a woman, every single cell knows that it is capable of creating another being. That is not present in a man, which is why they are at a biological deficit in that respect, or disadvantage. So we say in my culture, women create naturally through their body. Men have to create through here, ideas. And that is why they're always outside, searching and pushing, fighting, territoriality. There's mental territoriality, there's emotional, there's physical. And they're trying to gain something because they've got to prove to themselves that they are worthy, that they can stand alone against the elements. So, in line with what we spoke about, respect and so forth, I feel if we go back to basic principles and just look at biologically what's there, it is evident why a man has such a low self-esteem and therefore counters it by abusing others to try to raise their image and their understanding, because it is very evident that through the biology that we are, genetically speaking, there is an inner knowing in a woman's ability. Therefore, she has the nurturing, she is foundation, she offers structure, and true power is understanding what you are and simply being it.
Thank you very much for all those thoughts.
Thank you.
And I guess in the healthy way, a man who knows what he is and what he's made of and who he is equally as incapable of violence as a woman who knows that too. So perhaps violence can be well, I don't know. Question: can violence be seen? What you were saying a little bit to me, Konstantin, there was that violence is almost natural. So I hope it isn't. I'm not sure. A response.
May I just say, it's not even a response, it's instinctive, because it is the survival instinct, and that is controlled totally by our adrenal cortex. If you don't survive, you don't stay in your physical body long enough so that you can evolve. So there's nothing wrong with the survival instinct, rather it must not control and become the dominant factor in our life. Likewise with the ego and small self. That is adopted only in this life. It develops only in this life. If we are to go back to the premise that all religions and all wisdom traditions that I know of speak of a soul. And soul has been around for quite a while. Even if you're a young soul, you've had at least one, if not many hundreds or thousands. But the ego and the sense of self in this life was developed only in this life. It's a newcomer. And it's like the little school kid that puts its hand up and says, sir, look at me. Look how smart I am. Look how good I can do this. It's great. And it always finds a way of slipping in and somehow sabotaging what we already know about ourselves in terms of our purpose for being here and our essential nature. And I feel that somewhere in that relationship, the conflicts begin between the apparent world and the real world. And I could say a lot about that in quantum physics. It's an amazing thing that quantum physics has shown us today, that what it is that we're looking at is literally the direct result of a reflection back to us of our mindset and our life state.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot in yoga.
Yeah, and that is beginning to be the foundation of the quantum worldview. Yeah.
Fabulous. Yeah. Looking back at ourselves. Thank you. Okay, Nikola, I would love to explore a little bit about violence with you. So Nikola has recently hosted a woman called Melody Moore coming up from the States who was who was talking about body dysmorphia, body imagery and body security, I guess, how one feels about one's body. I'm thinking back to Sarah Ball, who was also on this panel last year. She worked alongside Nikola and Melody Moore when Melody Moore was here, and she used a statistic last year that 62, it was a very, very well-researched statistic, but I can't remember where because I never can. 62% of women do not involve themselves in positive life experiences or sporting experiences because they feel ashamed of their body, which is quite remarkable, really. 62% of women do not involve themselves in life-affirming physical activities because of their body difficulties with their concept of their own bodies. So I'd like Nikola just to talk a little bit about where she's coming from with her yoga and working with women in particular. Not that violence is all about men doing it to women, and I think that Jess really eloquently kind of explored how violence sits as a mode of operation in both sexes. Yeah. So please.
Thank you. Hello. I don't want to hold it because I move my hands around a lot when I talk. Okay. So I work a lot with women with eating disorders. I'm running a research program at Westmead Children's Hospital at the moment in the adolescent medicine unit, working with teens with anorexia. So that's a little bit of a background on the work that I'm doing at the moment. And it was interesting listening to Con because it reminded me of something that somebody tagged me on Facebook this morning, and it was a piece of film, and it was in black and white, and I had the sound turned down first time I saw it, and then I listened with the sound up. And there's images of women of different ages, and some of them are naked, making mudras over their breasts, and there's tattooed women just seeing part of their bodies doing this, and there's a woman gyrating with belly dancing, and then there's an older woman, and then there's a bigger woman, and there's a woman of colour. But what's happening in the video is that the camera is lingering on the women's bodies. Yeah? And when I listened to the commentary that goes with it, the commentary is this very spirited, rousing, empowering. Women, your body is a beautiful thing. You can reject what society says how your body should be. You can be empowered even if you are bigger, smaller, taller, darker, lighter than the ideal. And a lot of women had posted on this, how beautiful, I was very emotional, that made me cry, that's so wonderful. And it made me a bit grumpy. It made me really grumpy because it was an advert for another brand of yoga pants, all right? And in the same way that Dove and Kellogg's have now jumped on the, it's okay to have a body other than a perfect, thin, white, tall, 21-year-old Caucasian. This was also jumping on the bandwagon to say, well, it's okay to be different, to have different bodies, that's okay, but look, I've still got a product that's going to focus on your body and make you feel better about the body that you've got. And this comes back to Con's hypothesis, which I reject wholeheartedly, that somehow seems that violence against women is biologically predetermined, that it's some kind of Darwinian process, and that women are defined by the body and men are defined by the intellect. Now, this is a very common attitude that perpetrates the objectification of women, and women are objectified in the media, and they have been objectified for many years. You just have to look at the history of Western art particularly to see that the female body is constantly objectified, and we have internalized over many, many years that we are bodies, and that our bodies are there to be looked at. They are things, they are objects. That makes it easier for others to perpetrate violence on us because we are things, not people, we are bodies. And when that is internalized, that objectification becomes self-objectification, this is when women do violence on themselves, okay? So this is where we see eating disorders in particular, but all kinds of other mental health problems. 30% of women with eating disorders have experienced trauma, so some kind of violence perpetrated against them, often childhood abuse. And so we live in an environment where violence perpetrated on women is in some way socially sanctioned because women are considered bodies. And we see that part of the work that I do as a yoga teacher, I'm engaged with the Yoga and Body Image Coalition. It's all about saying, well, we're more than bodies. Don't reduce us to bodies. And if you look at the way that yoga is marketed particularly in the US, but also here, it's about objectifying women's bodies, right? If you go on any of the Instagram sites that have got female yogis on, it's all about, let's look at the body, let's look at them in this. It's all about objectifying the body. And this is what is the problem. And I don't care if you're objectifying a black woman, a white woman, a fat woman, a thin woman. If we're just looking at the body, then we're objectifying, and that's not good enough, and that's part of the problem.
Thank you very much. I think I see a similarity in the two things that you've said, and which is that we're here with the ego for just a moment, this birth, this incarnation, and we can tend to over-identify with it, and that's when the trouble kind of clicks in. Same thing with the women's issues, that if we over-identify with the body, or, you know, by having put that as a very strong option in front of us from a very young age, that we think we are this, then that's where the problem kicks in. And I really think that, you know, what Keenan, you were saying, that moving into the bigger self is probably the way through that. To understand that we're deeply connected to all things is probably the way through. And to understand that we're deeply connected to community is also the way through. And it would be hard to disagree with the fact that community's broken down a bit lately, last few hundred years. And it gets really hard because, you know, here we were sitting this morning in that amazing panel with our elders, and they were talking very strongly about the fact that, you know, when you're born, you know who you are, what you're here to do, and how you fit in and what your duties are. And your duties are large, but it's a joyful thing that, you know exactly who you have to feed, who you have to support, what you have to do within ceremony, etc., etc. So you're deeply connected in an interwoven web of existence, and that doesn't happen so much for us, does it, anymore? And we do tend to feel socially isolated, and we do go looking for meanings that aren't handed down to us from time immemorial. Is that what you call it? Time immemorial. Yeah, so you start to try and make it up through identification with ego, through identification with body, not with identification with capital S, self. I'm now going to introduce Kristina Karasulas, who has been working as the manager of Redfern Community Centre, and boy, what a job has she done. And so, you know, Redfern has had a lot of change over the last few decades, and is developing a stronger and stronger sense of community that's supporting those in it. And I'd just like her to talk a little bit about how that looks, or whether she feels that how the community is going in Redfern, and whether it's a good thing or not.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Kate. I was brought in very last minute, and I just want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and elders past and present. And if there are any people of culture here, I'm speaking only purely of my own views, and I don't want to take away from your own experience or anybody here of culture. As I said, I was just brought in because some of the other panellists weren't able to speak. I've been, what I would say, put in a very privileged position to be introduced and welcomed into a community that has a lot of history, and a lot of it is deemed really negative, and it's been painted horribly by the media, unsupported by the government, and it's just been basically a very tokenistic coin that's been thrown around for everyone to have a hold of and pass around. So for me, I'm really loaded in my mind with what I want to impart to you, and it's very difficult to put down into a sentence as articulately as some of my colleagues here. But really, for me, I think in the sense of violence and purpose and culture, and self-respect, is that everything that you've all talked about, then add black to it, and it adds a whole different dimension, especially in a country where the history has not been acknowledged, sense of culture has not been respected, and certainly history has not been imparted correctly, and people are very, very ignorant of the issues and where they've come from, and the journey that Aboriginal people have had to walk through settlement and their sovereignty taken away from them. So it's very loaded and complex, and as a result there is so much internal combustion and external, and where you're seeing people of colour, Aboriginal people and different clans not sitting comfortably with one another's opinions and ideas because there hasn't been an open conversation for them to speak for themselves, and that's why it's a little uncomfortable for me as a white person here again talking about issues. And so it's a little uncomfortable, but as I said, it's only my perspective. But I think the violence machine has done a great job at breaking up an extraordinary culture from its lineage and its natural pattern and flow. It's cut itself, the people from their land, from their spirit, through urbanisation, gentrification, and for people of culture to have to keep digging to find that connect. We've done a great job of putting such a big divide between that, and especially for young people coming in to try and connect to their culture. I will do a plug. We are putting a film on next Wednesday week called Zach's Ceremony, and it actually is one of the first documentations of a young teenager's journey through ceremony over the last 20 years while trying to live within an urbanised and a traditional culture. And it's a fantastic opportunity to get that insight of just how hard that is, and the judgments that come from people around traditional practice. So it's really hard to go into all the layers of it. And just as a personal note, being a woman of size as well, I think it's really interesting, some of the talk that's been around it. I sit very comfortably with all my yoga friends. I have many of them, but I can't get off the mat. So, but it's about being in the presence of and in breathing. And I feel like I'd just like to say I'm very comfortable with myself. Physically, I could be stronger and fitter. But as far as who I am as a person, this is bullshit. This is not me. It is, but there's way more to all of us, and we all choose ways to express ourselves. And I think that being a woman of larger body makes people feel really safe, and I love people feeling great about themselves. So I encourage my friends to come to the beach with me, and I go, you're going to feel so good about yourself. Just get in that bikini and shut up and get down the beach with me, because I don't give a fuck, and maybe that's negative, I don't, but and it has come from abuse, and I have had childhood abuse, and there's lots of reasons, and I can put tags on it, and I'm living that, and that's okay. It's my journey, and we all have one. So, whatever. So, judgment's a tough one, and we are tougher on ourselves than what other people's judgment are. But, I've had a successful relationship. I've had love. All of those things. So, we can pigeonhole ourselves that we're not going to have all of those things, but it's just not true. So, anyway, I wanted to add that.
So I'm interested to know how people are feeling about yoga these days in Sydney, and where we're going with it in terms of are we open and permissive, and are we helping people to move away from their attachment to body and ego, or are we not? So, or are we in part? And I'd love to know, have a little bit more dialogue around how people feel the yoga culture is in Sydney with regards to which way are we going, do you think, in balance? Maybe Keenan? Yep.
Say something on that.
Please.
It's been really fascinating for me because I've been a part of 4 studios and a couple in Melbourne, watching them start from scratch. And particularly after starting Bondi Beach a few years back, it was fascinating for me coming to teach at Bondi because so much body consciousness over this way, a lot of it. It's quite prevalent or quite evident to me because I step out of Northern Beaches, I step out of my little bubble and come over this side once a week, and there's a different mentality. And so teaching yoga for the first few months, I would be, telling people, hey, please come back to level 1, you're not a level 2 student, and be handing them little notes on the way out as they walk out with their phone, and just like, can you please Google Ujjayi breath? Because the amount of, and drishti, the level of, just people looking around and checked out, unpresent. And so it was quite alarming. It was really beginner level. But it's really common when a new studio opens to experience that, is that the standard of yoga or the standard of practice is very immature. But it's also then quite rewarding to watch how the community grow and people do move out of that. And I mean, I remember having discussions in the room of ego and discussing, it's just a phase you go through. You look at me, you look at my muscles, all this thing. And sure enough, the next week my class numbers were down. But progressively, little by little, I think the practice does the work. Is that it's not so much the philosophy or the understanding of it, but if you get on your mat and practice enough with intention to still the mind and become more aware, then naturally one becomes more conscious and less absorbed in self, little self. And so I think overall, from my perspective, the standard of yoga, I mean, it is predominantly physical. It has been, but it is expanding. I think more and more people are moving from just the physical to more the meditative side of things and starting to really deepen into the spiritual. And I've taught yoga in gyms, I've taught yoga in the city, and I've also seen how people initially come and ask just physical questions, all about the body initially. And give it some time, and before too long, they'll start coming and asking other things, more psychological questions or spiritual questions. And it's just fascinating to see how the practice does that. And so, I'm very optimistic, and I wanted to also add this in case I don't have a chance to speak again, which is that, as far as I'm aware, there's a spiritual revolution occurring, that there is more and more light spreading throughout the world, and I've witnessed a lot of people that are completely selfless, and I never realised those people existed until I travelled the world and met them. And the analogy that's been given to me I love is just that if you had a small light in a large warehouse, it only lights up a limited area. But as the light wattage increases, you start to notice the parts of the warehouse you may not have seen before. You start to see the dirt, the dust, the filth that's backed up in the corners. And so though we're seeing lots of calamities, and we're seeing this massive disrespect that people have for each other and the wars that continue, we are at a point, in fact I've read a document recently, that there's currently less war than there's ever been in the world. And so though, yes, things do seem quite dull and gloomy, there's great hope, I think. There's great optimism by many to think that actually people like us in this room do the work to continue to raise our own consciousness, to become more aware ourselves, and little by little that influences others, that influences the communities. And so I'm all for seeing a physical practice turn into a more spiritual practice, but it starts at the physical. And I think, the standard of yoga in Australia is improving with time, as everything does. So.
Thank you. That's very rousing. Very rousing indeed. Jess, how does it look from where you're standing? Do you think that violence is dwindling, or do you think that we definitely have more light on violence?
There's such a multi-layered, answer that you'd have to give to that. I guess that, what I'm noticing, and I'm looking very much at a historical view of how domestic violence has played out in society. We have very few sort of primary sources historically about what the nature of domestic violence has been over time. But what we can say is that what it was known as, certainly in the 19th century, early 20th century, was brutishness, usually brought on by drunken behaviour, sort of a penchant for violence. But really from the 60s onwards, what a lot of domestic violence experts have looked at is the increase in the amount of control. And they're saying that the reason why control has become such a big part of domestic violence is because actually to create a patriarchy in miniature in your home requires you to push against the tide of history, which is saying that women have the right to be treated equally. That wasn't the case before the 20th century. So domestic violence abusers didn't have to work so hard to convince their victims that they deserve to be treated like that. Now they do, because actually these women are being told by everyone else, you don't deserve to be abused. So it's very much in the home. There needs to be a far greater campaign of degradation, etc., that goes into convincing a woman that she should stay and be in that situation. But the other thing I really wanted to say quickly is the notion of respect is a very slippery and subjective one. And respect comes up a lot in men's behaviour change programs in terms of demanding that from their partners. A lot of perpetrators have an overinflated sense of superficial self-respect, and the self-respect, superficially, that they have for themselves requires absolute obedience from their partners. And when I say absolute obedience, I mean like sometimes on a level of control that is quite inconceivable, where arbitrary rules can be as ridiculous as vacuuming the house every day so that lines show up on the carpet, and if you don't do that, it's a sign of disrespect, and in that way affects the perpetrator's sense of self-respect. It's a very slippery web. So this, and that's the sort of thing that I see really, really often, much more than you would think, and from people who are not diagnosed with personality disorders. This is, to a large extent, a result of culture, not disorder. It's really important that people understand that. So I think that there's certain types of entitlement that we have around very slippery ideas of self-respect that can be actually very damaging when we do it at the expense of others. And I mean, in men's violence against women, it's extreme. In women's violence, it's far less extreme, and the control is usually not as big a feature. But certainly we see women doing that in everything from the workplace to sometimes how they parent, etc., etc. So I think we need greater consciousness about what respect actually means holistically, and that it doesn't come at the expense of others.
Thank you very much. I've been having a lot of thought about that lately, and hoping, a lot of hope about that lately, and the fact that, we are in a culture which is a bit like that. So if you're the boss of a big organisation, or you're the head teacher or the head guru, we're up to 17 or 18 major lineages where sexual abuse is now been outed. And I agree with you completely that it is about the light shining into the darker corners, and hopefully now that that's happened it will change. But the hierarchy, the simple concept of having a hierarchy implies, and it's all the way down, macrocosm to microcosm in this society. The simple attribute of a hierarchy is that someone is higher up the chain than those people down here. So my deep hope and deep desire is that yoga starts to lift our wings and starts to bring it to a point where everybody understands that they're as equal as anybody else, and all part of an interrelated relationship within this world, an interrelated grid of custodianship and care for each other, for the planet, and for themselves. So, in a situation where people understand that, then it's very hard to lead them to war. Then it's very hard to be in a situation where one person in the dark room can perpetrate against another person.
Cate, can I make one more point just on what you're saying?
Please.
You just made me think about one other thing, and also with what you were saying, is that I think when consciousness is a very painful enterprise. I personally believe, and so did a lot of philosophers, that that's the reason that we're here, is to become conscious, and it's the secular project, I guess, and it hurts, and you can see why a lot of people resist it. But what we see in domestic violence, and I'm sure we see it in other areas as well, is that as consciousness increases, you see a kind of backlash. A backlash from people who feel entitled to act certain ways. You see that in the United States. A black president is elected for 8 years, and then this massive backlash from the mostly entitled whites who feel like that's been an affront, and you get something like Trump, and it doesn't make sense, because it's sort of like, wow, there's been a lot of sensible stuff that's happened over the last 8 years. How could it result in that? But I think backlash has a lot to do with it as consciousness increases. In domestic violence, 2 of the helplines, state helplines, say that they are now getting phone calls with increased severity of violence that's gone up significantly, much more reporting of risk factors. Then that's partly to do with the fact that the conversation is on, and people who are perpetrating this violence are feeling the hate against them, and they respond badly. But that doesn't mean that the project is wrong to increase consciousness. It just means that in the meantime you might have a period in the middle that's quite ugly.
Ouch.
Yeah.
And to what extent do you think, Nikola, that yoga becomes a safety net for people who are going through stuff?
That depends what yoga they're doing. Right. So I agree with what Keenan said about how the yoga, if you do your practice, the rest evolves, but that depends on what your practice is. So I've worked with a number of students who have experienced trauma, childhood sexual abuse, eating disorders, and yoga becomes the new self-harm. And students who were going to 2 hot vinyasa classes a day, and they were doing that instead of cutting. And their pathology became normalized within the yoga community. Wow, you're so thin, right? Wow, you look great. Wow, you're so dedicated to your practice. Wow, you're a vegan who only eats raw X, Y, and Z. I mean, the orthorexia in the yoga community, which is having very restricted diet based on ideologies or health reasons, is quite strong. Also, I feel that yoga can be very excluding as well. So I think if yoga is taught as a one-size-fits-all program, that runs the risk of excluding many people who will benefit from the practice. And I have students and friends who are people of colour, who are people of disability, people of different sizes, and what you said resonated very strongly with me, all of whom have had hair-raising stories of going into general yoga classes and talking to the teacher about I feel a little uncomfortable, I'm a beginner, and then finding that they were either ignored or they were given instructions that singled them out. And not that the teacher was trying to be mean or that they were prejudiced, but that their needs, we're not educated as yoga teachers on the whole in how to work with people who don't look like the woman on the front of the brochure, right? And so I'm really, really, really encouraged by the number of studios and teachers in Sydney who are taking hold of this and are going, right, we're gonna start to work on a more nuanced level, and we're gonna start to be more inclusive, and we're gonna start to educate ourselves, and we're gonna make the yoga that we're teaching less intimidating, more inclusive. And I'm going to educate myself on LGBT issues because I don't understand what it's like for a trans man or woman to come into my class. That's my responsibility to find out what that's like and to be able to teach in a way that's appropriate to them. And there are incredible yoga teacher trainings now that are offering this is how you work with someone with a disability. This is how you work with someone who is more than a size 10. This is how you work with somebody who has a background of trauma or whatever it is. We're all individual. But there has been so much homogenization of yoga, and it is market capitalism, which is part of the hierarchical capitalist system, which is based on the supremacy of patriarchy and all of the words that you've been using that we're really nervous of using. But that is what is at play in the yoga community. And it's so encouraging to see many teachers disrupting that and saying, well, no, actually, we need to serve the students, not the studio owners.
Thank you. Yay. That's great.